Sometimes the smallest act of kindness opens a door that hard work alone never could. Sarah Mitchell had no way of knowing how true those words would become. At 35 years old, she spent most of her days worrying about things many people never thought twice about. Rent was due in less than 2 weeks. Her aging car needed repairs she could not afford. The electric bill sat on the kitchen counter waiting for a payment she was not sure she could make on time. Every dollar that entered her bank account already had a destination before it arrived. Yet despite the constant pressure, Sarah kept moving forward. She had to. Her 10-year-old daughter Emma depended on her. Every morning before sunrise, Sarah prepared breakfast, packed Emma's school lunch, and drove her across town before heading to work. During the day, she worked as an office assistant for a small insurance company. In the evenings, she picked up extra shifts at a neighborhood diner. By the time she returned home, exhaustion often followed her through the front door. Their apartment was small, but Sarah worked hard to make it feel welcoming. Family photographs covered the walls. Emma's drawings decorated the refrigerator. The furniture showed signs of age, but everything was clean and cared for. Sarah believed that dignity did not come from wealth. It came from effort. One Thursday evening, after finishing a late shift at the diner, she arrived home to find Emma sitting at the kitchen table working on a school project. "How was your day?" Sarah asked as she placed her purse on a chair. Emma smiled. "Pretty good. Mrs. Jenkins asked us what we wanted to be when we grow up." Sarah poured herself a glass of water. "And what did you tell her?" Emma thought for a moment. "I said I want to help people." Sarah felt her tiredness soften slightly. "That sounds like a wonderful goal." Emma looked up. "What did you want to be when you were 10? Sarah laughed quietly. "Honestly, I wanted to be a lot of things. But mostly I wanted a life where I could take care of the people I love." Emma nodded as if she understood more than most children her age. Later that night, after Emma went to bed, Sarah reviewed her finances once again. The numbers refused to cooperate. No matter how carefully she planned, unexpected expenses always seemed to appear. She closed the notebook and stared out the window. For a moment, uncertainty felt heavier than usual. The next afternoon, after finishing work at the office, Sarah walked through a small city park on her way to pick up Emma from an after-school program. The autumn air was cool, and golden leaves drifted across the walking path. As she passed a row of benches, something caught her attention. An elderly woman sat alone, looking worried as she searched through a large handbag. Several people walked by without stopping. Sarah slowed her pace. She could have continued on her way. She was tired, running behind schedule, and had plenty of her own problems. Yet something about the woman's expression made her pause. Sarah took a step toward the bench, unaware that this simple decision was about to change the course of her life. Sarah took a step toward the bench, unaware that this simple decision was about to change the course of her life. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Are you all right?" The elderly woman looked up with visible relief. She appeared to be in her late 70s, with silver hair neatly arranged beneath a light coat. "I am afraid I have misplaced something important," she admitted. "I cannot find my phone, and I am beginning to think I may have left it somewhere." Sarah glanced at the open handbag resting beside her. Receipts, notebooks, and various personal items seemed to be scattered everywhere. "Would you like some help looking?" The woman smiled gratefully. "I would appreciate that very much." Although Sarah was already running late, she sat down beside the woman and began helping organize the contents of the bag. After several minutes, they still had not found the phone. Sarah then remembered seeing a nearby cafe less than a block away. "Do you remember the last place you used it?" she asked. The woman thought for a moment. "I was at a small cafe across the street earlier." Sarah nodded. "Let us check there before assuming it is gone." Together they walked toward the cafe. Sarah called Emma's after-school program to explain that she would be a few minutes late, then accompanied the woman inside. Fortunately, the phone had been turned in by an employee and placed behind the counter. The elderly woman laughed with relief when it was returned to her. "You have no idea how much stress you just saved me," she said. Most people would have continued walking. Sarah smiled. "I think most people would have done the same thing." The woman seemed unconvinced. "Perhaps, but you did not." They introduced themselves properly over cups of coffee. The woman's name was Margaret Whitmore. She spoke warmly and carried herself with quiet confidence. Despite her age, there was an energy about her that immediately put people at ease. Sarah found herself enjoying the conversation far more than she expected. Margaret asked thoughtful questions about Emma, work, and life in general. Unlike many people, she listened carefully to every answer. When Sarah mentioned working 2 jobs, Margaret's expression softened. That must be exhausting. Sarah laughed lightly. Some days are easier than others. And yet you still stopped to help a stranger. Sarah shrugged. It felt like the right thing to do. Margaret studied her for a moment. That answer tells me more about you than you realize. Eventually, Sarah glanced at the time and stood quickly. She was now significantly behind schedule. Margaret insisted on paying for the coffee despite Sarah's objections. Before leaving, she handed Sarah a small card with her phone number written neatly on the back. I spend time in that park almost every afternoon, Margaret said. If you ever happen to walk through again, I would enjoy another conversation. Sarah thanked her politely, assuming they would probably never meet again. Life was busy enough already. Yet over the following week, she found herself thinking about the encounter. There had been something unusual about Margaret. Not mysterious, not dramatic, simply comforting. Then one afternoon, while crossing the same park after work, Sarah noticed a familiar figure sitting on the same bench beneath the autumn trees. Margaret looked up, smiled warmly, and waved. Without realizing it, Sarah smiled back. And for the first time in a long while, she felt as though something unexpectedly good might be entering her life. And for the first time in a long while, she felt as though something unexpectedly good might be entering her life. Over the next several weeks, Sarah Mitchell found herself stopping at the park more often. What began as a simple greeting gradually turned into a routine she genuinely looked forward to. Nearly every afternoon, Margaret Whitmore could be found sitting on the same bench beneath a large oak tree, watching people pass by and enjoying the fresh air. Sometimes they talked for 10 minutes. Other times, nearly an hour disappeared before either of them noticed. Margaret possessed a rare ability to make people feel heard. She asked thoughtful questions and remembered details that most people would forget. She always asked about Emma, about school, and about the challenges Sarah faced balancing work and family responsibilities. One Friday afternoon, Sarah arrived with Emma beside her. School had ended early, and Emma insisted on meeting the woman her mother had mentioned several times. Margaret greeted the young girl with a warm smile. "So this is the famous Emma," she said. Emma laughed. "I am not famous." "Perhaps not yet," Margaret replied with a playful grin. The conversation flowed naturally. Within minutes, Emma was telling stories about school projects, favorite books, and dreams for the future. Sarah watched with surprise as her daughter opened up more quickly than usual. Margaret listened with genuine interest and encouraged every ambition Emma shared. Before long, the three of them were laughing together as though they had known one another for years. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, their friendship deepened. Occasionally, Margaret would bring homemade cookies. Other times, she would recommend books for Emma or share stories from her own life. Yet despite all the conversations, there remained something mysterious about her. She rarely spoke in detail about her family. She mentioned having lost her husband many years earlier, but she never elaborated. She seemed financially comfortable, though she never discussed money. Instead, she preferred talking about people, experiences, and lessons learned throughout life. One afternoon, while snow flurries drifted gently through the air, Margaret asked Sarah a question that caught her off guard. "If you could change one thing about your future, what would it be?" Sarah thought carefully before answering. "I would like a little more stability. Not for myself, for Emma." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "And what would you do if someone gave you an opportunity to create that stability?" Sarah smiled. "I would work harder than anyone expects." Margaret seemed pleased by the answer. "That is exactly what I thought you would say." The comment lingered in Sarah's mind long after she returned home. A few days later, Emma brought home a report card filled with excellent grades. Sarah wanted to celebrate, but worried about spending money they did not have. When Margaret learned about the achievement, she suggested a simple picnic lunch at the park despite the chilly weather. They bundled up in coats and blankets and spent the afternoon sharing sandwiches and hot chocolate. Watching Emma laugh beside Margaret filled Sarah with a sense of peace she had not felt in years. For a brief moment, the financial worries waiting at home seemed less overwhelming. As the afternoon came to an end, Margaret looked at both of them with an expression Sarah could not quite understand. There was affection in her eyes, but also something deeper, as though she were quietly making an important decision. Sarah noticed it immediately. What she did not realize was that Margaret had already begun considering a future that would soon involve both her and Emma in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. What she did not realize was that Margaret had already begun considering a future that would soon involve both her and Emma in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. As winter settled over the city, Sarah Mitchell continued her routine of work, family responsibilities, and occasional afternoons in the park. Yet her conversations with Margaret Whitmore became one of the brightest parts of each week. There was something reassuring about sitting beside someone who seemed to understand life so well. Margaret never offered dramatic advice. Instead, she shared simple observations that somehow stayed with Sarah long after each conversation ended. One afternoon, while they sat watching children play in a nearby open area, Margaret asked, "What do you think people regret most when they get older?" Sarah considered the question. "The chances they did not take." Margaret smiled. "That is certainly one of them." She paused before continuing. "But I think many people regret not recognizing their own value sooner." Sarah laughed softly. "I do not spend much time thinking about my value." "Perhaps you should," Margaret replied. The comment lingered in Sarah's thoughts for days. Life had conditioned her to focus on survival rather than self-reflection. Every decision revolved around bills, schedules, and responsibilities. There was rarely time to think about larger possibilities. A few days later, Margaret invited Sarah and Emma to visit a small community center on the other side of town. The building was modest, but welcoming. Children attended after-school programs there. Seniors participated in workshops and social activities. Volunteers helped organize educational events and neighborhood gatherings. As they toured the facility, Margaret seemed unusually emotional. She smiled at staff members by name and stopped frequently to ask about ongoing programs. Emma immediately fell in love with the center. She joined a group of children working on an art project while Sarah and Margaret observed from nearby. "This place is wonderful," Sarah said. Margaret nodded. "It has been important to me for a very long time." "Do you volunteer here?" Sarah asked. Margaret smiled mysteriously. "You could say that." Before Sarah could ask another question, a staff member approached Margaret and thanked her for support that had helped keep several programs operating. The conversation was brief, but Sarah noticed the deep respect in the employee's voice. Clearly, Margaret's connection to the center was significant. Over the following weeks, Margaret occasionally invited Sarah and Emma back. Each visit strengthened their attachment to the community center. Sarah even volunteered to help organize a reading event one Saturday morning. Watching children enjoy books reminded her of why she had always loved learning. Margaret observed quietly from across the room, appearing pleased. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to leave, Margaret handed Sarah a small notebook. "What is this?" Sarah asked. "Something that helped me many years ago," Margaret said. Inside were handwritten quotes, reflections, and lessons gathered throughout decades of life. On the first page, one sentence had been carefully underlined. "Sometimes the opportunity that changes your life arrives disguised as a responsibility." Sarah read the words twice. When she looked up, Margaret was watching her with a thoughtful expression. Once again, it felt as though the older woman knew something she had not yet revealed. And as spring slowly approached, that hidden truth was moving closer than ever. And as spring slowly approached, that hidden truth was moving closer than ever. The following month brought warmer weather and longer afternoons. Sarah Mitchell continued balancing work, parenting, and the growing friendship that had become an important part of her life. Meanwhile, Margaret Whitmore seemed increasingly thoughtful. Although she remained cheerful, Sarah occasionally noticed moments when the older woman appeared distracted, as though she were carrying concerns she had not yet shared. One afternoon, after spending several hours helping with a literacy event at the community center, Sarah and Margaret sat together in a quiet meeting room overlooking a small garden. Children laughed outside, while volunteers cleaned up after the program. For a while, neither woman spoke. Then Margaret broke the silence. "There is something I have never told you." Sarah looked up. The seriousness in Margaret's voice immediately caught her attention. "What is it?" Margaret folded her hands carefully. "The community center means more to me than I have allowed you to believe." Sarah waited patiently. Over the months, she had learned that Margaret revealed personal matters only when she felt ready. "Many years ago," Margaret continued, "my husband and I helped create this place." Sarah blinked in surprise. "You founded it?" Margaret nodded slowly. "It started as a small project. We wanted families, children, and older adults to have a place where they felt welcome. We never imagined it would grow into what it is today. Suddenly, many things made sense. The respect shown by staff members, the personal connections, the pride Margaret displayed whenever they visited. Sarah smiled. That is incredible. Margaret looked through the window toward the children outside. For decades, it has been one of the most meaningful parts of my life. Then her expression became more complicated. But keeping it strong has become increasingly difficult. Sarah frowned slightly. What do you mean? Margaret explained that the center faced challenges common to many nonprofit organizations. Funding fluctuated. Volunteers came and went. Leadership transitions created uncertainty. Although the center remained active, its future required careful planning. I worry about what happens after I am gone, she admitted quietly. Sarah immediately understood the concern. The center was clearly more than a building. It represented years of effort, relationships, and service to the community. I am sure the board has plans, Sarah said. Margaret smiled gently. Plans are important. People are more important. The answer felt significant, though Sarah was not entirely sure why. Before she could ask another question, Emma entered the room carrying a colorful drawing she had created during an art activity. The picture showed the community center surrounded by smiling families and children. At the center of the drawing stood Margaret holding hands with several people. Margaret accepted the artwork with visible emotion. This is beautiful, she said softly. Emma grinned. I wanted to draw something that makes people happy. Margaret carefully studied the picture for several moments. Then she looked at Sarah and Emma with an expression that felt almost protective. Promise me something, she said. Always remember that places do not change lives. People do. Sarah nodded. I will remember. Margaret smiled, though her eyes seemed unusually reflective. As they left that afternoon, Sarah noticed her standing near the entrance watching families come and go. There was pride in her face, but also a hint of concern. It was the expression of someone thinking deeply about the future. What Sarah did not know was that Margaret had already begun putting important plans into motion, and those plans would soon place Sarah at the center of a decision she never expected to face. What Sarah did not know was that Margaret had already begun putting important plans into motion, and those plans would soon place Sarah at the center of a decision she never expected to face. A week later, Sarah followed her usual routine and walked through the park after work. The familiar bench beneath the oak tree came into view, but this time it was empty. At first, she assumed Margaret was simply running late. She sat down and waited for several minutes, checking the path occasionally. No one appeared. The following afternoon, the bench remained empty again. Sarah felt an unexpected sense of concern. Over the past several months, their conversations had become such a consistent part of her life that the absence felt strange. By the end of the week, she decided to call Margaret. The phone rang several times before reaching voicemail. Sarah left a friendly message and asked her to call back when she had the chance. Days passed without a response. Even Emma noticed the change. Have you heard from Margaret? She asked one evening while helping set the dinner table. Sarah shook her head. Not yet. Emma frowned slightly. That is unusual. Yes, Sarah admitted. It is. The following Saturday, Sarah and Emma visited the community center, hoping someone there might know whether Margaret was traveling or simply taking time for herself. When they arrived, the atmosphere felt different. Staff members moved quietly through the building. Several people stood in small groups, speaking softly. A feeling of sadness seemed to linger in the air. Sarah immediately sensed that something was wrong. She approached one of the coordinators she had worked with during previous volunteer events. The woman recognized her and offered a gentle smile. Sarah, she said quietly, I was hoping we would see you. Sarah's heart sank. What happened? The coordinator hesitated before answering. Margaret passed away peacefully earlier this week. For a moment, Sarah could not speak. The words felt impossible. Only days earlier they had been sitting together discussing books, families, and future plans. Emma's eyes widened with shock. She reached for her mother's hand. Sarah struggled to process the news. Margaret had become more than a friend. She had become a trusted presence in both their lives. I did not know she was ill, Sarah said softly. Most people did not, the coordinator replied. She preferred to focus on living rather than discussing her health. Sarah looked around the building that Margaret had cared about so deeply. Suddenly, every memory felt more meaningful. The conversations, the advice, the afternoons spent with Emma, the notebook Margaret had given her. Later that evening, After returning home, Sarah found herself rereading many of the handwritten reflections inside the notebook. One passage stood out more than the others. It read, "The greatest legacy is not what we leave behind. It is who we prepare to continue the work." Sarah stared at the sentence for a long time. Something about it felt different now, almost intentional. 3 days later, an unfamiliar phone number appeared on her cell phone during lunch. Normally, she ignored unknown callers, but something prompted her to answer. "Ms. Mitchell," a calm voice asked. "My name is Daniel Harper. I am an attorney representing the estate of Margaret Whitmore." Sarah sat upright immediately. "I am sorry, did you say Margaret Whitmore?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "Margaret left specific instructions requesting a meeting with you. There are matters she wanted discussed personally." Sarah felt a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "I do not understand. I realize this may come as a surprise," Daniel said. However, Margaret was very clear. She wanted you present when certain information was shared. Sarah looked out the office window as her heart began to race. Whatever Margaret had planned, it was only now beginning to reveal itself. Whatever Margaret had planned, it was only now beginning to reveal itself. 2 days later, Sarah Mitchell arrived at Daniel Harper's law office carrying more questions than answers. The building stood in a quiet part of downtown, and everything about it felt formal and intimidating. Sarah had never visited an attorney for anything beyond signing routine paperwork. She certainly never expected to be invited because of instructions left behind by a friend. Daniel greeted her warmly and led her into a conference room overlooking the city. Several folders rested neatly on the table. "Thank you for coming," he said. Sarah nodded nervously. "I am still trying to understand why Margaret wanted to meet with me through an attorney." Daniel offered a sympathetic smile. "You are not the only person she left instructions for. However, your situation is unique." That answer only increased Sarah's curiosity. Daniel opened a folder and removed a handwritten letter. "Margaret asked that this be read to you personally." Sarah immediately recognized Margaret's handwriting. Her heart tightened as Daniel began reading. The letter spoke about friendship, kindness, and unexpected connections. Margaret described the day they first met in the park and how impressed she had been by Sarah's willingness to stop and help a complete stranger despite clearly facing challenges of her own. Sarah listened quietly as memories flooded back. Then the letter became more personal. Margaret wrote about watching Sarah raise Emma with patience, determination, and love. She praised Sarah's character, work ethic, and commitment to helping others even when life was difficult. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. Few people had ever spoken about her in that way. Finally, Daniel reached the portion that explained the purpose of the meeting. Margaret revealed that she had spent many years searching for someone she believed could help guide the future of the community center she and her husband had founded. She had met talented people, successful professionals, and experienced administrators. Yet none of them felt right. Then she met Sarah. Daniel paused before reading the final paragraph. "Some people see responsibility as a burden. Sarah sees it as service. That is why I trust her." Sarah stared at the table in disbelief. Daniel carefully placed the letter down. "There is more." He opened another folder and slid several documents toward her. "Margaret did not leave you money. She did not leave you property. What she left was an opportunity." Sarah looked confused. Daniel explained that Margaret had established a leadership development initiative connected to the community center. The program would provide professional training, mentorship, and a salary position for someone willing to help manage and expand community services over the next several years. Sarah blinked repeatedly. "Why are you showing this to me?" Daniel smiled. "Because Margaret nominated you as the first candidate." Silence filled the room. Sarah could hardly process what she was hearing. She had expected perhaps a keepsake, a letter, or a personal request. Instead, she was being offered a chance to build an entirely different future. "There must be people more qualified," she said. "Many people have more experience," Daniel replied. Margaret was aware of that. Her decision was based on character. Sarah lowered her eyes. The responsibility felt enormous. The opportunity was exciting, but also frightening. Before leaving, Daniel handed her one final envelope. "Margaret asked that you open this at home." That evening, after Emma had finished her homework, Sarah opened the envelope at the kitchen table. Inside was a short note. The message contained only one sentence. "Sometimes the people who change our lives do not give us answers. They give us a chance." For the first time, Sarah began to realize that Margaret's greatest gift was not something she would receive. It was something she would have to become. For the first time, Sarah began to realize that Margaret's greatest gift was not something she would receive. It was something she would have to become. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Sarah carried Margaret's note with her everywhere, reading it whenever doubt began creeping into her thoughts. The opportunity Daniel Harper described seemed almost impossible. She had spent years focusing on survival, not leadership, managing programs, coordinating volunteers, and helping guide the future of a community center felt far beyond anything she had imagined for herself. Yet the more she reflected on Margaret's confidence in her, the harder it became to dismiss the possibility. One evening, after dinner, Emma noticed her mother staring quietly at the documents spread across the kitchen table. "You have been looking at those papers all week," Emma said. Sarah smiled. "I know. Are you going to do it?" The question sounded simple, but Sarah knew the answer was not. "I am not sure." Emma pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "Why not?" Sarah hesitated. "Because it is a big responsibility. What if I am not the right person?" Emma thought for a moment before answering. Margaret seemed pretty smart. Sarah laughed softly. She was. Then maybe she knew what she was doing. The comment stayed with Sarah long after Emma went to bed. Sometimes wisdom arrived from unexpected places. A few days later, Sarah attended a meeting at the community center with Daniel and several board members. She expected skepticism. Instead, she found encouragement. They explained that Margaret had spent nearly a year discussing succession plans and future leadership needs. Her recommendation had not been impulsive. It had been thoughtful and deliberate. One board member described how often Margaret spoke about Sarah's compassion, reliability, and ability to connect with people from different backgrounds. Another explained that technical skills could be learned, but character could not be taught as easily. By the end of the meeting, Sarah felt both humbled and overwhelmed. She still questioned herself, but she could no longer question Margaret's intentions. The following month marked the beginning of the Leadership Development Program. Sarah reduced her hours at the diner and began training alongside experienced nonprofit managers. She learned about budgeting, program development, fundraising, and community outreach. Every day brought new challenges. There were moments when she felt completely out of place. Yet there were also moments when everything seemed to fit naturally. Her experience raising Emma, managing limited resources, and helping others gave her a perspective many professionals lacked. Gradually, confidence began replacing fear. Meanwhile, Emma embraced the changes enthusiastically. She spent afternoons at the community center participating in activities and helping younger children with reading assignments. Watching her daughter thrive reassured Sarah that she had made the right decision. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after Margaret's passing, Sarah stood in the center's main hallway studying a framed photograph. The picture showed Margaret and her husband during the early days of the organization. They were smiling proudly beside a much smaller version of the building. Sarah felt a mixture of gratitude and responsibility. Margaret had not handed her success. She had entrusted her with a mission. At that moment, Daniel approached and handed her a report detailing recent growth in volunteer participation and program attendance. The numbers were encouraging. More families were being served. More children were receiving support. More community members were getting involved. Sarah looked around the building and realized something important. The opportunity Margaret left behind was already changing lives. And for the first time since receiving that unexpected phone call, Sarah stopped wondering whether she belonged there. Instead, she began focusing on how much more could be accomplished in the future. 1 year later, the transformation in Sarah Mitchell's life was impossible to ignore. The changes had not happened overnight. There had been no miraculous fortune and no instant success. What Margaret Whitmore left behind was something far more meaningful. She had left a path. Sarah simply chose to walk it. The community center was thriving. New educational programs had been introduced. Volunteer participation had reached its highest level in years. Family support initiatives expanded into neighboring communities. Children who once struggled academically were receiving additional resources and encouragement. Seniors found companionship through new activities and outreach efforts. The center had become stronger because people worked together, united by the same values Margaret had spent her life promoting. Sarah now served as the center's program director. The position came with stability she had never experienced before. For the first time in many years, she no longer worried constantly about paying every bill. She still lived modestly, but the fear that once followed her every day had gradually faded. More importantly, she felt fulfilled. Every morning she woke up knowing her work directly improved the lives of others. Emma had changed as well. At 11 years old, she had become one of the center's most enthusiastic young volunteers. She helped organize reading activities, welcomed new families, and encouraged younger children who lacked confidence. Whenever people praised her kindness, Sarah could not help smiling. The qualities Margaret had recognized in Sarah were now appearing in the next generation. One bright spring afternoon, the community center hosted a celebration marking another successful year of service. Families filled the building. Children laughed in the courtyard. Volunteers shared stories about projects and accomplishments. As part of the event, a new garden was unveiled near the entrance. At its center stood a simple plaque dedicated to Margaret and her husband. Sarah joined the crowd gathered around it. Daniel Harper stood nearby, watching quietly. As the ceremony began, several speakers reflected on the center's history and future. Eventually, Sarah was invited to say a few words. Standing before friends, volunteers, and families, she felt nervous at first. Then she noticed Emma smiling from the front row and found her confidence. "When I first met Margaret," Sarah began, "I thought I was helping a stranger." Soft laughter moved through the crowd. "What I eventually learned is that kindness rarely travels in only one direction. Sometimes the person we help ends up changing our life as well." Many people nodded in agreement. Sarah looked toward the garden and continued, "Margaret taught me that opportunity is not always something we receive. Sometimes it is a responsibility someone trusts us to carry forward." The audience applauded warmly. After the ceremony ended, Sarah remained near the garden while guests slowly dispersed. Emma joined her and looked at the plaque. "I wish Margaret could see all this," she said. Sarah smiled gently. "I think she can see it in her own way." Emma nodded thoughtfully. As the sun began setting, golden light filled the courtyard. Families gathered their children and prepared to head home. Volunteers exchanged goodbyes and promises to return next week. Looking around, Sarah realized that Margaret's true legacy had never been a building, a program, or an organization. It was the people whose lives had been touched and inspired to help others. She thought back to the day she first stopped beside a park bench to assist an elderly woman searching for her phone. At the time, it felt like a small decision, a brief moment in an ordinary afternoon. Yet that